Todd Fuhrman is joining us now from the desert. You can see him at Outkick, also bettheboardpodcast.com. He's with us on the JohnstonRVCenter.com hotline. Fuhrman, what is up? How are you?
I'm doing well, gentlemen. Trying to cram as much useless college basketball knowledge into my head before games kick off in earnest tomorrow, realizing that half of those teams will be eliminated by the time we wake up Saturday morning.
Hey, do you sorry, Brown.
No. I was just going to ask really quickly, if you don't mind. Jeff Goodman, and Fuhrman may have already known this, Jeff Goodman reporting now that Baylor's leading scorer, L.J. Cryer, is out for the entire first weekend. A, did Vegas know this? B, how does it affect Baylor?
Yeah, I mean, this is a Baylor team that I don't think any professional bettors were extremely high on coming in, arguably backed into the number one seed. We knew their depth was already going to be compromised given some of the injuries that they'd gone through previously. But when you look at Baylor's first two opponents, I'm not quite sure that Norfolk State will be able to push them even if they played some of their cheerleaders. No disrespect meant to Norfolk State and their win years ago against Missouri. And even in the second round against the North Carolina Marquette winner, I think Baylor was dealt a fortuitous hand. So without Cryer, it'll definitely hurt in their ability to find separation, especially laying a 20-plus point tariff. But at the same time, I think this is a Bears team who won't have to really start sweating until they were going to get into the Sweet 16 in a potential matchup against the winner of what I think will be UCLA and St. Mary's.
You know, Shaka Smart and Marquette kind of at a tailspin, losing 5 of the last 8, but North Carolina has won 8 of 10, and, you know, with that brand, that number would be interesting without Cryer, you know, down really 3 bodies. I would assume that number probably comes Baylor in the 6 to 7 range, which is kind of skinny for a 1-8 matchup.
Yeah, it would definitely come a lot shorter. And to your point, when you look at North Carolina, the one thing that they've done exceptionally well and they've continued to do over the years is hit the glass. And so if they're able to create second chance points, despite being a team that we've had outside of our top 25 all season long, it's going to create opportunities, especially if they want to turn this into a bit of a track meet where Baylor could be hard-pressed to match them bucket for bucket. So I think a lot of that will hinge on exactly what Baylor does against Norfolk State. If they struggle to find separation, that price will come out substantially shorter. And even with that announcement, you've only seen that number move from Baylor at the peak of the market to 21, now down to 20. I have to imagine it'll leak into 19.5 at some shops, but I still don't believe there'll be an appetite for Norfolk State. Different story when you're talking about a step up in class against an ACC or Big East opponent.
Todd Fuhrman, bettheboardpodcast.com, Outkick at Todd Fuhrman on Twitter with us on the JohnstonRVCenter.com hotline. If you're a Bama fan watching tonight's play-in game, does it matter to you, Fuhrman? Is there a team Bama would match up better with, Notre Dame or Rutgers?
I mean, I think for me personally, they'd match up a little better with Notre Dame, only because Notre Dame defensively doesn't provide some of the same challenges that Rutgers can. Although this is a Rutgers team that's a heck of a lot different away from home than what we've seen at the RAC. But when you dig into some of the numbers for Notre Dame, I mean, it's a team that's not going to turn you over in the half court. They're outside the top 70 when it comes to defending the arc. And while you can say what you want about this team overall from an offensive efficiency standpoint, they're going to be a little bit more methodical. And I think if Alabama's making shots, they should be able to take care of Notre Dame. Whereas I look at a Rutgers side, at least you have a player in Ron Harper that can take games over, and they'll contest shots a heck of a lot more than the Irish would on a possession-to-possession basis.
Hey, do you find it a problem for some, like when we fill out a bracket, everybody wants to be right, Fuhrman. And once you fill that bracket out, let's just say that you've got Houston playing Illinois in the second round, and you've got Houston winning that game, but you get a gut that Illinois is going to cover that number, but you talk yourself out of playing Illinois because you've already got Houston advancing. To me, it gets a little dangerous sometimes when you start looking at your brackets and you start handicapping at the same time.
Oh, 100%. I think the two things have to be separated from one another, and it depends what your priorities are. I know most folks are going to use their brackets as the be-all, end-all, and they want to stay true to what their initial thought process was going into the tournament. But for me, as soon as that bracket is filled out, it's cast aside, and I'm trying to bet games individually because there's a lot more money at stake on a night-in, night-out basis than what I can win from some pools and a lot of those variables that are oftentimes beyond your control. The one thing that I will offer up, the little bit of bracket advice here, based on the size of the pool, that's going to change strategy. And what I mean there is if you're in a pool, you know, with north of 1,000 people or some that are even bigger than that, you're going to have to take some chances and be willing to go all in to try and differentiate your entry from the field. If you're participating in an office pool where there may be 12 to 15 people, I always tell folks, err on the side of chalk. You don't have to play hero ball and try and be the one that advances a 13 seed all the way to the Elite Eight.
Todd Fuhrman with us on the JohnstonRVCenter.com hotline. Other than the number next to the name will tell me Kansas is the answer to my question here, but in the Midwest bracket, which team would Auburn fear getting to the Final Four? In other words, what's the worst matchup for Auburn in that bracket, in your opinion?
Yeah, I mean, this bracket, you have to give Auburn the benefit of the doubt, because if there were 3 teams on the 2, 3, and 4 line that I wanted to bet against, they all happen to find themselves in the Midwest bracket. I mean, teams trending in the wrong direction between Auburn late in the season and their struggles away from home, Wisconsin trying to figure out their identity, and we'll gauge the health of Johnny Davis in their opener against Colgate. And then, of course, the 4 line, where Providence is a modest 2-point favorite against South Dakota State for good reason. So when you look at the draw, if you want to try and figure out which team in the bottom half would be the biggest problem for Auburn, I actually think it could be USC as early as the second round. And the reason I say that is that USC actually is one of the few teams in the country that has some of the length at the rim. And if Auburn isn't getting shots to fall from the outside, SC will have the bigs that can contend and contest every shot possible. But for the most part, I look at that quadrant, and I think Auburn has a very manageable road to try and get into the Elite Eight, setting up a showdown against what most likely will be the winner of that Kansas-Iowa game in the Sweet 16.
Hey, back to South Dakota State and Providence. That game tips at 9:40 local time for you tomorrow morning. South Dakota State is a team that can shoot the eyes out of it, and Providence is a team as a 4 seed at 25-5 this year gets zero respect, but this number is only 2, as you mentioned. Now, we've seen in the past 31 times a 13 has knocked off a 4, but there are a lot of people that have South Dakota State moving forward.
Yeah, and I can understand the infatuation with the Jackrabbits. Look, I mean, they have the longest win streak of any team coming into the tournament at 21 games. They ran roughshod over their Summit League opponents. I mean, second in scoring in all of Division I, and they shoot nearly 45% from beyond the arc. If they're able to maintain that pace, it would be the best by an individual team since Indiana back in 93-94. And the one other thing about it is the Jackrabbits have done it in 10 straight games. They've shot better than 40% from the floor. Their undoing, though, can be on the defensive side, where they finished 7th in the Summit Conference in overall defensive efficiency. But they do have a couple players that can fill it up in Bailey Shireman and Douglas Wilson. You talk about Providence and LT. This has been one of the more fortunate teams in the entire country. 11-2 in games decided by 5 points or less. Finished 5-3 the last 8 games of the regular season. They were blown out by Creighton. They played a number of overtime games. But you worry if South Dakota State has the athletes to slow down some of the players that Providence will throw at them. This is a fascinating game. I would have loved to get South Dakota State +4, but at 2, it's right where I made the number, right in that 1.75 range. So I'm going to watch and see if there's a live in-play opportunity to bet this one.
I mentioned, Fuhrman, that Lance, here to my left, has Tennessee in his Final Four. I've seen a little bit of that. People have called them. I don't know if you're aware of this. Clay Travis thinks they're criminally underseeded at 3.
Clay said that about Tennessee every single year, even if they're not in the tournament. If they were in the NIT, they'd be criminally underseeded as well.
Are you a Vol believer?
I do think this is the best team that Rick Barnes has had over his tenure at Tennessee. The problem that I've had in terms of trying to assess the Vols is Rick Barnes has underwhelmed to where it matters most at the betting window. You look at his ATS numbers, 1-11-1 against the spread over the last 13 games that Tennessee has played, and he has been a perennial underachiever when the lights get the brightest. Now, they were dealt a bit of a fortunate bounce, not just by playing Longwood in the opening round, but that Michigan will most likely be without its key catalyst offensively in Devontae Jones, who was ruled out for the opener against Colorado State with a concussion, and I don't anticipate him getting back. So I think Tennessee gets into that Sweet 16 setup, and then you have to try and figure out what kind of adjustments Rick Barnes can make, because from 1 to 10, Tennessee, in my opinion, is much more talented than Villanova, should that be their opponent. But I give a massive edge to Jay Wright and what he would bring there. So for me, that I think is the most intriguing game of that round. If Tennessee can answer the bell there, I don't think they're going to be intimidated should they run into Arizona in the Elite Eight, a team that they beat at Thompson Bowling earlier this season.
Hey, not a lot of times will you see a lot of people, jumping on an 11 seed over a 6. And look, that's a pretty balanced. It's 90-54 all time in the NCAA tournament. And you mentioned Rick Barnes. His former team, Texas, is now a 1-point favorite against your ACC tournament champion, Virginia Tech. Had to win the tournament to actually get into this tournament. And now people are all over Virginia Tech. I think you're getting some value here with Texas.
You are definitely getting a buy low opportunity with the Longhorns. The problem being is, in my opinion, I think this game will boil down to how it gets officiated. If refs are going to let the teams play, it's a huge edge for Texas, because the one thing with Virginia Tech, it's a team that's going to run a ton of motion on offense. There are going to be a lot of cutters, and what we've seen from Chris Beard teams in the past, they love to clutch and grab, and if they're able to do that, it'll throw Virginia Tech's offense quite a bit. The problem with the Longhorns, and why a lot of the metrics suggest that this team is underseeded and should have a higher ceiling, they do a lot of the basic basketball things the right way. They shoot well from the foul line. They don't turn it over. The problem is, if you watch Texas throughout the course of the season, the eye test suggests something different, that they end up defaulting to a lot of iso ball. They don't have a ton of players that you really fear beating you one-on-one off the dribble. I made this game a pick'em, so I don't see a whole lot of wiggle room, but I wouldn't fault anybody who wanted to take the contrarian angle going against the hot hand in Virginia Tech. But this is also a Tech team that I think has exceeded people's expectations late, but a lot was thought of them coming into the year. It was just a question of how long it would take some of their transfers to gel.
All right, 2 questions before you go. This first one, you do us a tremendous favor by coming on the show regularly. So I would never want you to unveil any proprietary information that you might make money off of or whatever. So you can pass on this first question. Give me a Cinderella that you love that maybe nobody else does.
You know, I think when you go through the brackets and you try and identify teams that have the capabilities to make runs, Vermont is getting a lot of buzz, and rightfully so. I mean, it's a game that we broke down in greater detail on our Bet the Board podcast that we recorded this morning. This is a Catamounts team that does things the right way. They don't turn it over. They're extremely efficient offensively. And while it's going to be a jolt to their system from a speed and athleticism standpoint, I think John Becker has done a tremendous job. And I think Vermont is a team that's more than capable of not only winning one game, but beating the winner of UConn, New Mexico State, to make a deeper run. And one other team that I have my eye on, and we'll see if they're capable of being a giant killer, I think this Davidson team is poised to get to the Sweet 16 as well. I know they'll have their hands full in their opener against Tom Izzo and Michigan State. I don't love anything I've seen from Duke. I think Coach K has failed to make adjustments, and while he clearly has some of the most talent in all of college basketball, they don't play together as a cohesive group. They haven't shown toughness. They haven't shown grit. And Davidson doesn't get the chance to play an in-state rival often. They'll never get a chance to have Duke in their own building. Coach McKillop would see this as a great opportunity to potentially put the final nail into Coach Krzyzewski's coffin during his tenure at Duke.
That's a bad way to go out. If you're a Duke player and you let Coach K go out losing to Davidson,
that would be bad.
It was bad enough losing to Carolina at home on his final regular season game. This might be worse. Well, it would be worse.
I'm just not sure that this team has shown that they can wake up. I mean, you figured that the game against North Carolina, when Coach K calls them out in the post-game festivities, they would have been much more engaged, but they were anything but. I mean, if Syracuse has Buddy Boeheim, they could have lost that game. They weren't great against Miami, and they never showed an ability to take the first shot from Virginia Tech. When things got tough, they couldn't get a big stop, and they don't really play well together as a team, and we've seen it more often than not. Unless you have that transcendent talent and one player that can take over, you got to be pulling in the same direction, and I just haven't seen enough of that from the Blue Devils.
All right, the second part of my question was the team that has gotten so trendy in Vegas that all you people like you and Lance are like, all right, I got to go the other way. The public is way too hot on this team.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to go the other way because there are some guys that I really respect on them, but I think the South Dakota State Providence storyline has gotten to be fascinating because people look at that number and they immediately gravitate towards the Jackrabbits, despite probably not having watched them play throughout the course of the regular season. So that's one game that I would kind of keep tabs on and see how it all unfolds. The other interesting one that I haven't seen anybody talk about a potential for an upset, I'll give you two of them. No one talking about San Francisco and their potential to beat Murray State. I think people are already moving the Racers into the next round to set up a game against Kentucky.
I got them, Fuhrman.
Yeah, I figured you would, LT. USF is an extremely talented team, and it looks like their big and Masalski will be a go for their opener. The other game, Penny Hardaway's bunch. Everyone talking about what a Memphis-Gonzaga game would be and how great it would be. I can understand why people are skeptical of the Mountain West. It's a conference that's underwhelmed, but this is a Boise State team that I think has an edge on the sideline box with Leon Rice, and they have guys that are extremely athletic and a veteran-laden group. That's one that I'm going to be fascinated to watch because I'm not sure I agree with the market that's moved Memphis into a 3.5 point favorite.
Man, that is 15 minutes of exceptional NCAA tournament talk. You guys love Fuhrman, so go listen to his podcast. BetTheBoardPodcast.com. You get much more of what he's just done here. BetTheBoardPodcast.com. See him on Outkick with Clay and the gang there. And he is always very kind with his time with us. Fuhrman, enjoy the tournament. Can't wait to talk about more of it next week.
Always a pleasure, gentlemen. Look forward to it.
All right, buddy. Take care of that. It's Todd Fuhrman, at Todd Fuhrman on Twitter. Boy, his knowledge. I mean, you fire him any of these
Yep.
games, he's got something on it. It's crazy.